Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello everyone. Welcome to the fourth installment of our High Elevation 5 Needle White Pines 2025-2026 Science and Management webinar series. I'm Karina Lee, a master's student at the University of Colorado, Denver, and I am your host this month instead of Enzo. Sorry if it's not quite as smooth this beginning, but I'm co-organizing the series with Enzo Martelli Moya, a PhD student in Kara Nelson's lab at the University of Montana, and then I'm here with Lou Deloisi, a PhD student in Danielle Urich's lab at Montana State University. We have another great presentation for you today, and I'll start by introducing our board member, Tio, who will share a few announcements with us. Welcome, Tio.
Great. Thanks, Karina. Hi, everyone. I'm Tia Rotu, and I'm the treasurer of the foundation. Today, I'm excited to talk about the student research grants that we are offering for 2026 in support of our mission to promote the conservation of high elevation 5 needle white pine ecosystems. So right now, we are offering a $1,000 to $2,000 award to any undergrad or graduate student that is conducting research or writing a thesis on any high elevation 5 needle white pine in North America. So it can be whitebark pine, bristlecone, boxtail, sugar, or western white pine. For 2026, we are again partnering with John Van Gundy to offer a second award of $1,000 or more for anyone who's doing research on high elevation 5 needle pine dynamics under climate change. So we're accepting proposals that can address a variety of topics, such as threats to high five pines, wildlife interactions, restoration strategies, ecosystem and landscape impacts of pine decline, or social and policy dimensions of conservation and restoration. The money from these funds can be used for salary under some situations, travel expenses for field work, or consumable research supplies. But the Van Gundy grant can also be used for research analysis. So the deadline for this grant opportunity is February 14th. Applications need to include a short proposal, maximum 2 pages, a CV, and a letter of recommendation from your research advisor. For the folks who receive these grants, you will be expected to publish a research summary in our biannual Nutcracker notes, and you will be encouraged to share your findings at future Whitebark Pine science meetings or the annual conference. So I'm going to post the request for proposals in the chat, and you can also find that on our website. Please share this RFP to anyone else who might be interested. Again, that deadline is February 14th. And to submit your application, you'll need to electronically send your materials to Cindy Smith, whose email address will be in that request for proposals. So with that, I am happy to take any questions, or I can hand it back to you, Karina.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for joining us, Tio. I have just a couple things to say before I introduce our speaker. If you missed any of our previous installments, you can find recordings of our talks on our YouTube channel. We try to get those uploaded, as soon as we can. Sometimes there's a little bit of a lag, but the link to our website will be posted in the chat, where you can find that channel. And then finally, after the presentation, we will have a Q&A session where you can share all your comments and questions. Please post them on the chat box, and our team will collect them, and we'll talk to the speaker at the end. With that, I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Diana Tomback. Diana is a professor of integrative biology at the University of Colorado, Denver. During her PhD at UC Santa Barbara, she discovered that Clark's nutcracker was the primary seed disperser for whitebark pine. And in 1986, Diana had the seminal opportunity to join a federal interagency research team to study the decline of whitebark pine, and later served as lead editor of the book Whitebark Pine Communities, Ecology, and Restoration, which was published by Island Press in 2001, which became a principal reference for the petition to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to list whitebark pine under the ESA. Also in 2001, Diana and colleagues founded the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation. You've heard of it, for which she served as volunteer director for 17 years, and she now oversees the policy and outreach at WPF and is a key organizer of the National Whitebark Pine Restoration Plan in partnership with American Forests, and serves on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Whitebark Pine Recovery Team. But despite all of these impressive accolades, I think Diana will agree that her proudest achievement has been serving as my master's advisor at CU Denver. Just kidding. It's the other way around for sure. The deeper I get involved in the white bark world, the more I realize that Diana is truly an authority in this field. She knows everyone, and I feel really lucky to learn from her. So, without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Diana Tomback and her talk titled Restoring Whitebark Pine: Plans, Strategies, Toolkits, and Technology.
Thank you so much, Karina, and I am very proud to have you in my lab, actually. And the work you do is fantastic, and we have a good time. So that's great. Um, I am very pleased to be here today. Without further ado, I think I better get going on my talk in consideration of everybody's time. Let me see if I can deal with the technology here. Looks like we're ready to go. And I assume, Karina, you'll be monitoring chat questions in case I don't pick them up. So thank you very much. And we'll
Yep,
get
definitely.
we'll get started. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, your slides look good, by the way.
Yes, well, I'm struggling now to try to change there we go. I'm going to have to use my clicker here. All right. I want to point out that the purpose of this presentation is not to provide kind of a Restoration 101 course, but rather to cover several topics that are emerging and to address certain issues. So a quick overview. For those new to whitebark pine, I will set the stage here. Talk about restoration goals, strategies, plans, provide an overview of restoration actions. Now, considerations that I want to highlight, blister rust resistance, geographic variation and restoration actions, the use of reference conditions, a shout out there to Kara Nelson. Direct seeding is a kind of relatively new tool in our toolkit. Climate change impacts, nature-based restoration solutions, Clark's nutcrackers, we can't forget them, and then hopefully the benefits of biotechnology. So it looks like I'm going to have to use my clicker to change things. Interesting. All right. So how do we encapsulate what whitebark pine is? Well, first of all, whitebark pine, Pinus albicaulis, is a widely distributed forest species of the western US and Canada, but it has a very narrow elevational range. It's found in the upper subalpine and at tree line. In the US, it's primarily non-commercial, but it has been logged and may still be somewhat in Canada, but not on crown lands. Ecologically, it's important. We call it a keystone and foundation species. And whitebark pine is of cultural and traditional significance to Northwestern Native Americans and First Nation peoples. Whitebark pine was described first by Engelmann in 1863. So let's look at its classification. It's in the genus Pinus, the white pine subgenus Strobus, the section Cincifoliae, the five-needled white pines, and the subsection Strobus. And here we have some pictures representing whitebark pine across its range. Banff National Park would be the Northern Rockies in Canada, through the Northern Rockies of the US, the Cascades, windblown whitebark, and then at the southern end, the Sierra Nevada. Here we have some graphics from US Fish and Wildlife Service from the species status assessment. their depiction of the Whitebark Pine Range. So Whitebark Pine ranges from about 36 degrees north from the Southern Sierra up to British Columbia, 55 degrees north, near Smithers. And its North American range is estimated at about 33 million hectares. The U.S. portion is the lion's share, according to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, 70% or about 23 million hectares. Now, in the U.S., about 88% of whitebark pine is on federal land. 74% of its distribution in the U.S. is on U.S. Forest Service land. 10% is on National Park Service land, 4% on Bureau of Land Management land, and 12% is considered other. It's tribal lands, state and private lands. An updated map from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service of whitebark pine ecoregions. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife, in their species status assessment, identified 15 ecoregions across whitebark pines range. 5 of these are in Canada. So these ecoregions are based on geographic variation in whitebark pine communities and environmental conditions. This is all highly relevant to discussions of appropriate whitebark pine restoration actions. We need to do more research to understand these ecological differences and to describe them. So Clark's nutcracker is key to whitebark pines' continuation on our landscape. The birds determine through their seed caching behavior where whitebark pine grows. Nutcrackers have seed cache site preferences, and those in relation to immediate environmental conditions determine whether seeds germinate and seedlings survive. So nutcracker seed dispersal impacts the growth form. We see a mature tree with multiple stems, most likely each one a distinct genet, and these arise from a single nutcracker cache where nutcrackers can cache anywhere from 1 to 15 seeds or more. Nutcracker seed dispersal also impacts population structure, fine scale population structure because we've got these stem clusters, but also regional structure in part due to the long distances nutcrackers will disperse seeds. So all is not well in the whitebark pine world. In Canada, whitebark pine was listed in 2012 as endangered under the Species at Risk Act. In the US, it was listed in 2023 as threatened under the Endangered Species Act by the US Fish and Wildlife Service. I know a number of you have heard talks that I've given before and have seen this slide before, but I call it my go-to 4 horsemen of the whitebark pine slide. There are 4 threats to whitebark pine, and the existential threat is white pine blister rust caused by the pathogen Crenartium rubicula. This pathogen is introduced. Mountain pine beetle outbreaks. Mountain pine beetles are a native insect in the West, and they periodically undergo very widespread outbreaks. These have been fueled in recent decade by climate change. Altered fire regimes, also fueled by climate warming. We're seeing higher fire frequency and severity, even at subalpine elevations. And of course, climate warming, which is causing drought stress, fires, altered tree distribution. We'll be talking more about that later. So a few more words about white pine blister rust. It was introduced inadvertently in the 1890s to the East Coast of the US or to North America, because even though this map stops short at the US boundary, it's in Canada as well. It was introduced in the 1900s to the west coast of North America. So the hosts are 5-needle white pines. They are all susceptible. The alternate hosts are species of the genus Ribes. These are currants and gooseberries. And The pathogen kills branches in five-needled white pines. These are where the cones are born. So cone production can be lost even as trees are still alive. If there are cankers that girdle stems of trees, the tree will be killed. It takes longer to kill a larger tree than it does a smaller stem tree. We have a nice snapshot of whitebark pine's health status across its U.S. range, thanks to the paper by Goking and Islar. So they used U.S. Forest Service forest inventory and analysis data across whitebark pine's U.S. range and found that as of 2016, 51% of all standing whitebark pine trees in the U.S. were dead. That number was higher based on a 2019 paper or that they published, or a later paper they published, 2021, actually. So we see the epicenter of white pine blister rust infection is the Northern Divide ecosystem, also known as the crown of the continent. And I mentioned that this continues over on the Canadian side as well. The threats to whitebark don't just stop boom at the U.S. border there. So less than 10% of basal area is estimated to remain here. And the Northern Rockies actually have suffered more than other parts of whitebark pine's range. The healthiest populations to date are in the Sierra, where more than 90% of the basal area remains, but there are still hot spots, you might call them, such as in the Lake Tahoe region, where there is a high blister rust infection level. So let's take a deeper dive into these threats and their interactions and implications. So Crenartian rubicola, it infects and kills all age classes, from seedlings to, very old trees. By killing trees or damaging canopies, it reduces seed availability. That reduces the probability of seed dispersal by nutcrackers and reduces genetic diversity. With mountain pine beetle, the beetles generally attack only mature cone-bearing trees, so seedlings and saplings are usually not impacted. It reduces seed availability by just killing these mature trees, which are very important as seed sources, reduces the probability of seed dispersal by nutcrackers, and again, reduces genetic diversity. With this interaction, mountain pine beetle kills trees with genetic resistance to the blister rust pathogen, and white pine blister rust kills trees resilient to mountain pine beetle. I'll just comment that recently there have been some publications that have shown that certain physiologies in whitebark pine and wood structures, tree morphology, make certain individuals more resilient to mountain pine beetle, and we wonder whether there is a genetic underpinning. Now, fire, finally, kills all age classes, kills trees with genetic resistance, resilience to both blister rust and mountain pine beetle. And regeneration in this case depends on long-distance seed dispersal. Whitebark pine climate change predictions. They predict range expansion to higher elevations and higher latitudes, range loss at forest, lower elevation, trailing edges across whitebark pine's range, reduced regeneration and seedling survival predicted, and we're beginning to see this, and likely delayed recovery after wildfire and other disturbance. There's some indication we're seeing this already. According to Parks et al., 2025, just came out this fall, 75% of the climatically suitable range for whitebark pine by mid-century will be in wilderness areas and national parks. Let's look at the pillars of whitebark pine restoration now. We're transitioning to how we deal with the threats. So we need an overarching statement of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to develop and sustain healthy and resilient whitebark pine communities in the face of current and future challenges. So here are our restoration goals: build resilience to white pine blister rust, reduce the forest conditions promoting mountain pine beetle outbreaks, promote climate adaptation, protect trees from fire and mountain pine beetles, and proactively build resilience in regions where whitebark pine is still healthy. Tall order. So I'm going to take an interlude here, take a moment just to put our restoration in some sort of historical perspective, at least recent history, and give some organizations and individuals some recognition here. So it was in the late 1980s that Dr. Stephen Arnaud, and he was one of the founding members of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation, and Dr. James Brown, both of the USDA Forest Service, Missoula Fire Laboratory. Then it was the Intermountain Research Station. They gathered an informal group of researchers and managers to determine why whitebark pine was declining in the northern Rocky Mountains. I am proud to say I was part of this group. The expertise was truly multidisciplinary. People who worked in forest communities, forest ecology, fire ecology, nutcracker seed dispersal, community modeling, grizzly bear biology, forest pathology and genetics, and on mountain pine beetles. And I'll mention another board member, Bob Keene, was a member of this pioneering group as well. So there were some landmark achievements of this group. The very first major conference on whitebark pine, 1989, Bozeman, Montana, Montana State University. It was the Symposium on Whitebark Pine Ecosystems, Ecology and Management of a High Mountain Resource. So this research team continued to work, hold small workshops, meet at least once a year, sometimes twice, at the Fire Lab in Missoula, exchange information, ideas, talk about things that needed to be studied. For our work, we received the USDA Forest Service Centennial Conservation Award in 1991, continued our work, started shifting discussions to restoration of whitebark pine, realizing just how drastic the decline was looking. In 1998, we put on the conference Restoring Whitebark Pine Ecosystems in Missoula, Montana. It was there at the Holiday Inn. And from this came the book, Whitebark Pine Communities, Ecology and Restoration through Island Press. And then it was actually at that conference that we discussed what next steps could be. And it was Dana Perkins, still a member of the WPEF, who actually suggested we put together an NGO. And a group of us actually went ahead and established the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation. So changing gears a bit, switching gears, I want to address the difference between a strategy versus plan. Most of us don't think about this at all. Strategy and plan are not interchangeable in meaning and often confused or combined. And I think we are all we're a little confused. Both approaches are used widely in business and politics, but the approaches can be integrated, and I think that's what most of us have done. So strategy reflects higher level planning by identifying long-term goals, objectives. It is the general process to meet these goals and objectives. So a strategy provides the guidelines for decision-making. It is about reaching a desired endpoint. A plan provides the details to achieve each goal within a strategy, with the specific actions, timelines, and resources required. We haven't yet put together specific plans. A plan focuses on the details of actions, in other words, required to achieve each strategic objective. So here are the key restoration and conservation strategies and plans at different scales. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has the Whitebark Pine Recovery Plan in progress. We finished the first round of the National Whitebark Pine Restoration Plan in 2024. This was an undertaking between the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation, American Forests, with advisement by the U.S. Forest Service. We hope it is a living document, and we do have some updates that we'd like to add at this point. Bob Keene led the range-wide restoration strategy for whitebark pine in 2012. The Bureau of Land Management put out their conservation plan for whitebark pine in 2016, led by Dana Perkins. Government of Canada has put out a recovery strategy for whitebark pine in 2017, and that was a draft, so it may be in progress. At the regional level, the Greater Yellowstone put out an adaptive action plan in 2015, but it is also a living plan. 2015 was a revision, but I think it continues to be rethought. The Pacific Northwest region of the Forest Service, Region 6, put out a restoration strategy in 2008. I believe a revision either has been done or it is in progress right now. And California has put out an interagency conservation strategy for whitebark pine in 2020. We have one transboundary document. This is the Crown of the Continent Ecosystem High Five Working Group, whitebark pine restoration strategy that is ongoing. So even though I said this was not Restoration 101, a course in restoration, I do want to go through some of the key restoration actions and treatments for whitebark pine. So number one is conserving genetic diversity across whitebark pine's range. And agencies, the U.S. Forest Service primarily has been doing seed collections for seed archiving. Two, promote genetic resistance to white pine blister rust. I'll say more about this in a little bit, but this is absolutely critical. The start is to identify genetic seed zones, or what we might call seed transfer zones across the range of whitebark pine. This entails screening candidate trees for genetic resistance, identifying sufficient numbers of resistant trees to serve as the sources for planting and, say, direct seeding. We do not want to bottleneck the species. In some locations, we can use these trees to develop seed orchards by grafting scion on rootstock when appropriate for operational seed production. It makes it a lot easier to protect these seeds rather than having distributed seed sources. So then this leads to planting whitebark pine resistant seedlings to restore populations, enabling us to build resilience to white pine blister rust and even climate change. And I will add, we can deploy direct seeding rather than seedling planting if planting is not an option. More about that in a bit. We want to protect seeds with known blister rust resistance or high-value stands. We want to protect them against mountain pine beetle or fire. We want to reduce competition in successionally advanced communities, and I'm adding where appropriate because this community type is not everywhere across the whitebark pine range. This action would entail applying silvicultural treatments, depending on what stand conditions might be and what the goals are. I will point out that having open conditions, a lot of light is critical for whitebark pine seedling growth. Otherwise, we end up with degenerate regeneration. We could judiciously use prescribed fire as a restoration tool. That is becoming less and less likely given the prevalence of fire and the dangers of fire these days. 6, implement treatments proactively to build resilience in healthy whitebark pine communities. One thing we know about blister rust is it's on the move. It's spreading. Blister rust is coming. And we can build resilience in those communities, such as in the Sierra Nevada, that are not yet widely affected by blister rust. We can use planting or direct seeding to increase resistance. Of course, we need to assess whitebark pine health and stand conditions in order to devise restoration treatments to identify the ones that are appropriate. We also need to monitor stand health and conditions over time for changes. And then number 8, key again, for all restoration treatments, we need to develop monitoring plans, and we also need conservation actions for stands. And it is imperative we integrate monitoring into project planning and use. We need to determine whether what we're doing is working, and if not, change what we're doing. So some more key considerations. As I mentioned, the most important restoration action to maintain whitebark on the landscape is to plant seedlings or deploy direct seeding using seeds from white pine blister rust resistant parent trees. So the goal is really to speed up natural selection by increasing the frequency of resistant genotypes in our whitebark pine communities. The cornerstone of proactive restoration is also to identify planting and direct seeding opportunities to increase resilience in these healthier communities. And we also need to take climate change into consideration with our planting and direct seeding. Would it be appropriate to consider seed sources from predicted future climate areas? In other words, other seed zones that are under warmer, drier conditions, would they be appropriate for seed zones that are now not considering that? So geographic variation, whitebark pine communities, something I want to highlight. And I want to use this as a caveat for restoration applications. First of all, successional communities and the role of fire are predominant in the Rocky Mountains of the US and Canada, and some intermountain populations such as the Blue Mountains, and in some areas in the Cascades. They are not everywhere, which means this idea of using silvicultural treatments to reset succession or prescribed fire is not appropriate across all areas. We mostly have self-replacing climax communities throughout the remainder of the range, the Sierras, Cascades, Great Basin ranges. And I do believe that managers are aware that they need to do more research in these areas to determine the historical role of fire. Some additional thoughts. We need to consider connectivity and genetic diversity in whitebark pine populations as we do our restoration. We need to establish component populations, taking connectivity and adequate effective population sizes in mind to maintain genetic variation. Jenkins et al. 2022 has a detailed discussion of these recommendations, and I really recommend looking at this paper. I do have a bibliography attached to my talk that hopefully can be available to people. We need to use local reference conditions as we do restoration to anchor whitebark pine restoration projects in local ecology, to do what is actually appropriate for local conditions. I want to thank Kara Nelson for promoting this idea. I'll also point out, and Kara would agree, that given climate change, reference conditions are somewhat of a moving target, but we have to use local stand structure and composition as a template for our restoration work, such as whitebark pine density and appropriate microsites where whitebark pine can grow. And I can't help but emphasize monitoring and using monitoring for adaptive management. When we do a restoration project, we have to determine whether objectives are met, and if not, what changes are needed. And the use of control sites is part of a good restoration protocol. It's recommended for comparisons because you need to know to what extent it is your restoration treatment that caused change or whether change would occur on its own otherwise. Now, I would like to talk about direct seeding. It's sort of a new kid on the block, a relatively new tool in our toolkit, even though it's been kind of experimented with since the 2000s. It's an experimental restoration approach right now. That's the caveat. And it's based on us caching whitebark pine seeds like Clark's nutcrackers. So nutcrackers cache about 1 to 15 or more whitebark pine seeds per cache under about 1 to 3 centimeters of substrate across montane terrain. Now, I'd like to point out that nutcrackers place their caches pretty much ubiquitously, pretty much everywhere. On steep slopes, exposed slopes, south-facing, west-facing, that have early snowmelt, open forests, closed forests, even dense canopy forests, bare rocky terrain, recent burns, clear cuts, tree line, and tundra. It's just that some of these areas have better environmental conditions for whitebark pine growth and the needed light that whitebark pine requires. Whitebark is moderately shade intolerant. And so nutcrackers are basically caching everywhere, but if we're going to cache like a nutcracker, we need to be smart in terms of what conditions we put seedlings in our direct seeding. So from my doctoral work, I actually learned that most of the caches that were buried were at the base of trees. A number were in the open, base of rocks, forest litter, around tree roots. Some seeds were actually cached in trees. Teresa Lorenz has also documented this, and some are actually placed in the middle of plants. So we need to use this information to inform our direct seeding efforts. So as mentioned, direct seeding is an experimental restoration approach, and it potentially solves several whitebark pine restoration challenges. So sites on steep remote locations that will not work for seedling transport or planting crews, these are good candidate areas for direct seeding. About 29% of whitebark pine's range is in federally designated wilderness. Interpretation of the Wilderness Act by some agencies restricts planting of seedlings in designated wilderness. This is where direct seeding could play a role. And according to Sean Parks et al. 2025, as I mentioned, by mid-century, 75% of climatically suitable whitebark pine range will be in designated wilderness and national parks. We need to think this through. We need to either figure out how to modify the Wilderness Act or how to identify appropriate restoration for these areas. So the benefits of the use of direct seeding, it's easy to backpack seeds to remote terrain instead of transporting and planting seedlings. If we want to put the effort in, we can actually collect cones in wilderness nearby, remove seeds, and deploy seeding to reduce what is called trammeling or disturbance in the Wilderness Act, human disturbance. The costs are less to do direct seeding. To grow and plant a whitebark pine seedling is greater than $3 a seedling. That doesn't even count collecting cones, removing seeds. The cost per seeding cache is about 20 cents. So the drawbacks are you need a sub-meter accurate GPS and a marking system to relocate seed caches for monitoring. The system widely used was pioneered by Elizabeth Pansing, who was a doctoral student in my lab and is now with American Forests. There are restrictions, though, on using this marking system in designated wilderness, and that includes in national parks. So we have to figure out how to monitor. This is the big challenge. Direct seeding has been found where deployed to have highly variable germination rates and seedling survival. And there's a reluctance right now to use white pine blister rust resistant seeds in direct seeding until higher success can be documented. So some of the direct seeding variables that can be explored. I will mention to date, there have been several direct seeding projects in whitebark pine core areas developed for the National Whitebark Pine Restoration Plan. And these have been in collaboration with American Forests and led by Libby Pansing. So variables potentially affecting pilferage by rodents, these are key. I would say one of the major downsides of direct seeding would be seed loss to rodents. And chipmunks and deer mice are the culprits here, the major culprits. So we're experimenting at this time with density of direct seeding caches. We just last summer experimented with a low density, 60 caches per hectare, and all the way up to a high density, 320 caches, per acre. We're concerned about human scent on caches and a bit at a loss about what to do about that. Should we deploy direct seeding during a masting year or a non-masting year? This needs to be explored. Should we do trapping studies to assess annual rodent densities and some of these rodents cycle, and maybe we should avoid a peak of cycle? We also need to determine when rodent densities are lowest during summer and fall, in other words, pre-reproduction. There are also variables that could impact seed germination rate and proportion, and I should mention that the longer the direct seeded seeds are in the ground, the more vulnerable they are to pilferage by rodents, so to speed up germination would be very useful. Stratification or treatment before caching, peroxide seed rinse to reduce fungal pathogens, identification of suitable microsites, etc. I want to quickly address climate change and restoration considerations. As I mentioned, climate change is altering whitebark pines distribution. We are seeing stress and drought mortality at lower elevation trailing edges, and there's a reference list on this slide that documents a lot of this. We have reduced rate of post-fire regeneration, rapidly altered suitability of conditions now for seed germination and even seedling survival because of challenges with moisture, summer drought. We are seeing higher seedling survival at tree line elevations. And the Parks et al. Paper predicts the climatic niche for whitebark, the range to contract by 80% by mid-century. We have figure 3 from this article. So on the left side, we have the reference period, 1961 to 1990, showing bioclimatic suitability and a probability of whitebark pine occurrence of 0 to 1. And below, we show only those sites with a probability of greater than 0.5. And then on the right side, the projected distribution of whitebark pine by mid-century, much contracted. And if we look at the probability of greater than 0.5 of occurrence, considerably contracted to present day. So the implications for restoration of climate change, these are huge. Restoration projects should be prioritized for areas projected to be in climatically suitable areas for the foreseeable future. We should also consider moving whitebark pine genotypes across seed zones, as I mentioned previously, for climate adaptation. We need to apply the RAD framework, the resist, accept, direct, to restoration for decision-making for specific sites, areas, or regions. We can also consider microsite modeling for micrositing of seedlings and direct seeding. We can do this even where conditions are supposed to deteriorate. We can place our seedlings and direct seeding under suitable conditions, even within a larger landscape. So for example, some of this modeling was done by Stephen Heisman, who developed a 1-meter scale water balance model. He downscaled regional climate using local slope aspect, soil lapse rate to estimate actual evapotranspiration and climatic water deficit. His goal was to identify planting locations to protect against drought stress. He applied this to the Surprise Lake area in Grand Teton National Park, as we can see from this 3D figure. The park is doing direct seeding and seedling planting. So this is actually a 3D heat map. And the lighter the color, the higher the climate water deficit. So these really light areas are the highest 350 millimeters. So by doing this, this can help us direct our restoration actions, and it could be scaled up, done at a much wider scale. Now, quickly, I'd like to talk about the application of nature-based solutions to whitebark pine. This is perhaps a novel finding. Whitebark pine is declining in Yellowstone from all the threats we've talked about. This left-hand map is based on whitebark pine monitoring that is interagency. All told, there are blister rust hotspots in the greater Yellowstone, but about 25% of whitebark pine is infected to date. And the right-hand map shows whitebark pine mortality on long-term monitoring plots due to mountain pine beetle infestation. So I'll also point out that lodgepole pine is extremely widespread in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and particularly Yellowstone National Park. And mountain pine beetle outbreaks have killed millions of hectares of mature lodgepole pine in Yellowstone National Park. This is a map from the park, and the lavender color represents the distribution of lodgepole pine in Yellowstone National Park, quite a bit. And lodgepole pine in the park is subalpine, it's lower subalpine, up to upper subalpine. So we ask whether mountain pine beetle kill of lodgepole pine is a regeneration opportunity for whitebark pine. Whitebark pine distribution in the park does overlap with lodgepole pine elevations. So at this point in time, many of the mountain pine beetle killed lodgepole pine are falling, creating canopy openings and deadfall. We noticed this in the course of other research we did. We also noticed abundant whitebark pine regeneration in lodgepole pine understory. But our question was whether this regeneration could produce cone-producing canopy-level trees. So in my lab, doctoral student Ali Algamdi has asked this question working in 3 different lodgepole pine study sites in 2 different park regions. Let me point out, as I mentioned before, that whitebark pine is considered moderately shade intolerant, does not grow well under closed canopies, and it needs recent burns and disturbances to create canopy openings to facilitate regeneration of whitebark pine. Anyhow, I'm going to quickly show you one preliminary result from Ali's work, and he is beginning to write this up. So we did a logistic aggression analysis for whitebark pine that was breast height, 130 centimeters and higher. This would include some canopy whitebark. And we found that it grew on plots that had higher canopy openings, greater canopy openings. So in other words, canopy openings are indeed conducive to whitebark pine growth and possibly the production of cone-bearing trees. So stay tuned for more work by Ali and details on the system. This has an application, this nature-based solution. So on the left, we have the distribution of lodgepole pine, and it is prevalent throughout our higher mountains of the West, including the Cascades and the Sierra Nevada. And here I have a graphic from Sinesco et al. 2023 based on screening whitebark pine across 9 seed zones in Oregon and Washington. So the screening done at Dorena Genetic Resource Center indicated some hotspots of genetic resistance. I would say at least 3 or 4 of these seed zones had fairly high incidence of high resistance in whitebark pine. So I'll point out these little pie charts. The darker the blue, the higher the resistance. There's a scale here on the right. And these areas where these trees have been found are adjacent to lodgepole pine, and lodgepole pine has been similarly killed by mountain pine beetle in the Cascade region. So it is possible we can have a nature-based restoration solution going on its own there, a naturalistic contribution to whitebark pine regeneration. I will remind everyone that whitebark pine needs healthy regional populations of Clark's nutcrackers, even though several of us are working on this, including Karina Lee, your host. There's still much to learn. Use of seed resources, dynamics of individual spatial movements, population numbers over time, impacts of declining whitebark pine forests on nutcrackers, and if whitebark pine is restored, will nutcrackers return? So I do need to point out, without nutcrackers, whitebark pine will not persist. And finally, future needs, biotechnology and infrastructure. Whitebark pine restoration clearly needs to be done at a large scale. So number one, we need a better way of identifying blister rust resistant seed resources or seed sources. And we're hoping that genomics will fast track the identification of resistant trees and other adaptive traits. For example, climate adaptations, resilience, maybe even resistance to mountain pine beetle. So there is genome work at play here. We've got the genome sequence of whitebark pine published by David Neal and colleagues in 2024. And work based on this, trying to look at specific genes. So we are hoping that genes for resistance, first of all, will become clear and help us in our identification instead of the long, arduous process of screening followed by field trials to identify white pine blister rust resistant seed sources. In the meantime, we do need additional resistance work. We need more trees screened to increase the genetic diversity of our seed sources. We need long-term field trials to see if resistance might change because the rust is changing. And we need to at least maintain or increase the genetic diversity represented by screen trees today. We also have operational needs. I understand from a number of colleagues that large-scale seed collections are a real bottleneck in whitebark pine restoration. But we also need the nursery infrastructure to grow the seedlings. We need to ramp that up. We also need to think seriously about acceptable restoration actions for wilderness areas and designated wilderness in national parks. Quickly flash the references that were key and helped educate me. And I want to give a shout out to a number of colleagues for conversations over time and even recently. And I also want to thank the folks who attended the direct seeding roundtable at our 2025 Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation Science and Management Conference. This helped gel some of the thoughts that I presented today. And with that, I'll stop sharing and be happy to answer questions in the remaining time. Thank you all.
That's great, Diana. Thank you so much. So we do have a few minutes for questions. We'll probably just get to maybe one or two. And don't worry, if you have questions, please ask them in the chat and we can send them to Diana and we'll make sure to get those answers to you. But we'll start with Amanda Hornig asked if there's any data available for whitebark populations in Canada. We did have Jody Krakowski offer a publication by Shepard et al. In 2020 from 2025, but wondering if you have any ideas for Amanda in terms of more updated information, specifically, I think about whitebark mortality rates.
I have not seen, now it was actually Brenda Shepard's last publication, I believe it was in 2019, where they revisited the Parks Canada, the original plots that Cindy Smith took the lead on and put in. So I think 2019 is the last time I saw something on this.
Yeah, it's the same group, I think, that did this
Right.
2025 publication, so that's probably the best.
Yes, I think that's the best. And I think at that point, things had not changed that remarkably over the previous remeasurement. So it may be that they're slowing down the frequency of, how often they revisit the plots. So.
And then Gene Collins asked if there's any research that you know of being done to see if plants that have antiviral and antifungal properties could be used maybe in combination to combat blister rust. Do you know of any studies like that?
So, in other words, is the thought to take extracts from these plants to combat blister rust? So, one thing I'll point out is that there are antifungal. I don't know about antiviral because right now, let's hope we don't get a whitebark pine virus. That's the last thing we need. Yeah, I can't, avian flu from nutcrackers. Oh
Oh, yeah.
no, we don't want anything like that. But there are antifungal compounds out there. The main problem has always been the challenges of applying them across millions of trees, and how to apply this. So when blister rust first became a problem, and it was in commercial timber species, and caused incredible concern. There were lots of possible solutions that were explored, and these antifungal compounds were developed, but just proved impractical for widespread application. And the other problem is you'd get good fungi, like mycorrhizal fungi, in the process. So, we've got to be really careful here. I think genetic resistance is going to be our best bet here.
Yeah, I think that's something I'm always really curious about is if there are some important funguses that we actually really need for whitebark pine. And I don't, hear a lot of studies on that, but it might be a crucial component that deserves some investigation.
Well, actually, there have been a couple of studies on what the mycorrhizal fungi are that are on white bark. And there are some uh, high elevation mycorrhizae that are specific to five-needled white pines. So it's thought that maybe these are probably the best and the most effective mutualists, I'd say, with
Mm.
white bark. So we do have to be careful about that for sure.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I think we need to wrap up. Again, we will ask Dr. Tomback your questions and get some answers. But on behalf of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation and the webinar organization team, we really want to thank Dr. Tomback for your participation. And our next webinar series will be on January 20th, so mark your calendar. That'll be Lydia Druin, who's an ORISE Ecology Fellow with the U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station, and she'll be discussing her work on modeling tree survival across the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And we just thank you again, everyone, for attending, and please stay tuned for our upcoming installments. Bye, everyone.